Hi, I'm Tim. Join me as we go through a short history of the Japanese Zero World War II fighter aircraft. Let's get to it. As you can see in the previous video, the Japanese Zero flies very well as a Guilo's radar control model airplane. I'll put a card up of my two videos getting the Guilo Zero to fly. However, the Zero was a primary fighter aircraft of the Japanese Imperial Navy between 1939 and 1945. Close to 11,000 of these remarkable aircraft were built. And in this video, we'll go through a short history of this remarkable aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was a long-range fighter manufactured by the Mitsubishi Aircraft Company. It was one of the primary fighters of the Japanese Navy, serving from 1939 until 1945. Close to 11,000 of these aircraft were built. The Zero is a remarkable aircraft in that when it was a design competition, one of the competitors literally pulled out of the design competition saying the requirements were just too hard to meet. The Japanese had a lot of combat experience with the A5M aircraft in the China theater before the outbreak of World War II in the United States in December of 1941. And what the Japanese realized, what the Navy realized, is they wanted a fighter that was extremely maneuverable, had a good climb rate, but most importantly had extremely long range. Range being important to the Japanese concept of operations to include distance as well as time over the fleet to defend the fleet. The range of the Zero was close to 1,800 miles, which is roughly double the range of any U.S. fighter, so it was a remarkable accomplishment to meet this. The way the designers met this was to make an extremely lightweight aircraft. It was one of the lightest fighters around, and with very careful design, flush rivets, even flush gun ports in certain models, it could achieve these design objectives. Japanese pilots flying the Zero were extremely well trained. They knew their aircraft well, and they knew the advantages and disadvantages of their aircraft. It was a very maneuverable fighter for dogfights, and what Allied pilots realized pretty quickly was that due to the high training of the Japanese and their ability to maneuver the aircraft, tactics had to adapt. It's not commonly known, but the P-40s, which were the Flying Tigers in China, never flew against the Zero, or rather they flew against the A5M aircraft. However, the primary U.S. Navy fighter at the outbreak of World War II up to September of 1943 was the F-4F Wildcat. The F-4F Wildcat was an older fighter, and to be effective, as well as its follow-on, the F-6F Hellcat, you had to come up high, just do a diving attack and turn away from the fight to have any chance of effective tactics against the well-flown Zeros. It's worth noting the Japanese pilots were exceptionally well trained. This tended to be a weakness towards the end because the pilots were very good, but they could not suffer a lot of attrition. So the Japanese did not have an effective way to replace pilots as they were shot down. The U.S. found a fairly intact Zero that landed at Atkun Island in the Aleutians. The pilot was forced down, died instantly in the crash. Americans recovered the aircraft, put it back together, so they had a much better understanding of how the airplane was built, its strengths, weaknesses. It was often described by the engineers as built like a fine Swiss watch. Just everything went together perfectly. For example, the wings were assembled to the fuselage in the factory. The U.S. put it back together, brought it back to the States. This is a picture of the Japanese Zero in U.S. Army colors, ready for its various test flights. The plane was very well designed. You can see in this cockpit, the charging handles for the machine guns are actually in the cockpit. Everything, it's just a minimal cockpit, what you need to safely and effectively fly the airplane. There's oftentimes discussion that the Zero was a primitive aircraft. It didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks, not a lot of armor. Keep in mind when the specifications were laid out in 1937, 1938, very few aircraft had self-sealing tanks or armor. It was just considered extra weight and not needed. As the war went on, uh, fire suppression units as well as self-sealing tanks were developed to include armor for the pilot. As the war progressed, especially with the introduction of the F-6F Hellcat in September of 1943, the Hellcat was designed to counter the Zero. Tactics, training, everything improved for the U.S. It was no simple fall off of the Japanese. It was just a grinding of the war, attrition. The Japanese just could not keep up with production or significant changes to the airframe to counter the Allied onslaught. Other things that helped with the Allies was things as basic as radar. Carriers started having capable radar systems to detect where the Japanese fighters were coming from to launch and prepare for the eventual attacks. With the designer's intense focus on lightweight to achieve its range goals, they came up with a special light metal covering ESD or extra super duraluminum to make the airplane. The metal worked great, but it was very corrosive. Anti-corrosives had to be applied at the factory. Because this aluminum decayed so quickly, it's one of the reasons there are so few Zeros flying today. Out of the close to 11,000 built, probably there's only about 3 flyable examples in the world. Should you want to make an RC model, it's not a well modeled project. I think the aircraft looks great, and there's a range of design schemes that could make your model unique, and they look pretty good. The designers obviously wanted a successor to the Zero. This was designated the A7M. This is the initial design work. What held us back, the Japanese simply didn't have the design staff needed to fulfill all the work to do something of this nature that late in the war.